Hey guys, welcome back to Fantasy Tips. My name is Julian, and we all know what we're doing today. We're continuing my series of episodes talking about each individual NHL team in alphabetical order, and today we're talking about the Nashville Predators. This is actually finally past the halfway point of this series, and I can assure you the rest of the series will be out before this season begins. Now in this video, we're going to be going over Nashville's projected lines that I project for their team next year. Then we're going to go over their noteworthy players, and I'm going to talk about whether I think you should consider drafting them or not. Before we get started though, guys, please leave a like, hit the subscribe button, and hit that notification bell. More than half of you guys that watch the channel are not subscribed, so I definitely would appreciate hitting that button. And if you do want to take your support to the next level, the link to my Patreon is down in the description. Now let's jump right into it, and let's jump into the lines that I'm projecting Nashville to have this year. And on the top line, I have Filip Forsberg, Ryan Johansen, and Matt Duchene. On that second line, Nino Niederreiter, Mikael Granlund, and Philip Tomasino. And on the third line, Tanner Jeannot, Colton Sissons, and Jakob Trenin. So first on, let's have Roman Josi, who finished the season last year with 96 points in 80 games, had the most points out of any defenseman in the league. Absolutely unreal fantasy season. And to me, he's the second best defenseman in fantasy this year, and he's going with an ADP as the fourth best defenseman. Definitely good value for you there. Then second on the list, I have Juuse Saros, and he's really solid value here at his ADP of 41.3. He's the fifth goalie off the board, and he's definitely going to be a top 5 goalie in fantasy this year. Juuse Saros is going to get a lot of starts, and he single-handedly keeps his team in the game every single night. Definitely like him here at an ADP of 41.3. Then I have Filip Forsberg, who finished as the 8th best player in terms of fantasy points per game last year. Am I expecting him to do that again this year? Absolutely not. His shooting percentage last year was 18.6%, which is incredibly high, and his on-ice shooting percentage was very, very high as well. So that is definitely going to regress. However, even with a pretty sizable regression, I still project him being a top 30, top 40 player this year. And with an ADP of 57.6, as long as he can stay healthy, he's pretty good value. And then I have Matt Duchene, who's currently listed as a right winger, lost that center eligibility that he had last year in fantasy. And I'm always very wary of Duchene. He's very, very boom or bust. Last year at the age of 31, he set a career high in points with 86 points and ended up as the 38th best player in terms of fantasy points per game. For one thing, that shooting percentage is going to go down a decent amount. His on-ice shooting percentage was also fairly high, so definitely some of his stats are going to come down. With regression in both his goals and assists, he definitely should still finish as a top 100 player. But at this value, where he's currently being drafted, I don't see him as crazy good value. But if you do end up drafting him, don't feel too bad. It's not a terrible draft pick either. Then I have Tanner Jeannot, who had a nice big breakout in his rookie season last year, ended up with 41 points in 81 games, which is pretty solid. His personal shooting percentage was a little bit high, but his on-ice shooting percentage was average, so he may score some fewer goals, but he will probably get a few more assists next year. But his value mostly lies with the hits and penalty minutes categories. Last year, he finished with the third most penalty minutes in the league and had the second most hits in the league, only behind Radko Gudas. So he's definitely someone who's very, very valuable in bangers leagues. If you don't have hits in your league, I do not recommend drafting him just because he's not going to pay off his value. If you do though, I really do like him at his current ADP of 164.1. He ended up as the 100th best fantasy player in terms of fantasy points per game last year. So even with a little bit of regression, he's still definitely going to be worth that ADP. Definitely like him in hitting leagues. Then I have Ryan Johansen, who had a really nice bounce back year last year with 63 points in 79 games, which is really, really solid. But look at that shooting percentage, guys. It was 22%. That is something that's not even close to sustainable, guys. Ryan Johansen has never gotten even anywhere close to that number before, and that is going to regress a significant amount. That on-ice shooting percentage was also very, very high, so he's going to regress quite a bit. Now, even with that super inflated shooting percentage and on-ice shooting percentage, he only finished as the 140th best fantasy player in terms of fantasy points per game, and at around 170, he's definitely not going to be worth it because he's going to regress a lot more, and he's also a natural center, which makes his value really not that high. Then I have Philip Tomasino, who NHL.com has 221st on their list of the top 250 best fantasy players this year. This could be accurate if he does end up playing in the top 6 this year. Last year, he didn't really get an opportunity to play in the top 6, and I think he's a really, really talented young player. And if he does, he definitely could have some value. As of right now, though, he doesn't really have an ADP in fantasy, so you don't need to draft him. Definitely keep an eye on him, though, and if he does end up playing in that top 6 and ends up producing, he's someone that you can definitely end up picking up in the first couple weeks of the season. Next, I have Nino Niederreiter, who they newly acquired this offseason in free agency, who was a pretty good signing. Last year had 44 points in 75 games. It ended up as the 144th best fantasy player last year, which is pretty good. This year, though, he's going to be playing on Nashville. Probably won't see top power play time, but should see top 6 time, probably alongside Mikael Granlund. That's definitely not a terrible place to be deployed. But let's just note that last year he was on a very strong Carolina Hurricanes team and had a little bit of a high shooting percentage. So I'm not super high on him, but he's currently not really being drafted at any ADP. So late in your draft, I don't mind throwing a dart at Nino Niederreiter. And then I have Mikael Granlund, who at no ADP at all seems like an absolute steal. Last year scored 64 points in 80 games, ended up as the 171st best fantasy player, was pretty solid all around. But unfortunately this year, he lost his right wing eligibility. And as I've been saying in almost every one of this series of videos, center and just center is not a super valuable position this year because there are so many natural centers this year that makes it just really not very valuable. However, as you can see though, he's not really being drafted in any leagues. So I actually kind of like picking him up after your draft if you put someone on IR and you grab him, or in the last round of your draft. Because guys, the NHL season starts this year with 2 games, Nashville versus San Jose in Prague, Czech Republic. They play on 2 days before the NHL season even starts. So you're going to get a couple of games in from a pretty good player in Mikael Granlund right away for your week 1 matchup to get, a nice little advantage for that week 1 matchup. Then you can consider dropping him or swapping him for somebody else after those 2 games. But those 2 games happen before any other games on the NHL schedule. So having someone from Nashville or San Jose can definitely help you win your week 1 matchup. Then I have Mattias Ekholm, who's currently being drafted at an ADP of 176.8, ended up with 31 points in 76 games last year, but honestly overall had a pretty lousy year, really was not good at all fantasy-wise, and ended up as a 269th best fantasy player. However, towards the end of the season, he ended up playing a lot better and was definitely someone who was fantasy viable. So if he can play that way the whole season this year, I don't absolutely hate drafting Mattias Ekholm. 176 might be a little bit early, but if you can get him a few rounds later and you're really desperate for a defenseman, he's someone that could be worth a pick. Ryan McDonagh, on the other hand, is not worth a pick. Other than the block shots category, he doesn't really bring a whole lot to the table, and I am definitely avoiding him this year. Same thing with Eeli Tolvanen. Ended up with only 23 points in 75 games last year and was a top 6 player for pretty much the entire season. That is not good enough for me, and I don't see him performing that much better this year, especially since I see Filip Tomasino taking his spot in the top 6, and Tolvanen could end up playing on the bottom line. I'm definitely not drafting Tolvanen in fantasy this year. And that's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. Please leave a like, hit that subscribe button, and if you do want to take your support to the next level, the link to my Patreon is down in the description. Thanks so much, guys, and I'll catch you in the next episode of Fantasy Tipped.